Today we're going to take a look at the third session of Genesis. This is a painting for our week this week of Jewish holiday. We're still in high holidays and celebrating some of the same things that Jesus might have celebrated in his day. So our main topic this time is going to be about Noah and the flood. We studied about creation, about God working through creation and having a relationship with human beings and all of nature. It comes to a time when, as the story goes, there is no longer great respect for God, and God says that he's sorry he ever created man. So we'll see how this plays out in the story of Noah and his descendants. We have come to know that God is relational. That means he interacts with all of his creation, with the animals, the plants, and human beings. And that everything is good when there is a relational balance between God and creation. That is the goal. And just a quick look back on the Pentateuch themes that we are following. It is the Creator's continued commitment, or God's continued commitment, to have a good creation, and that he chooses throughout the story of the Pentateuch persons to work with him on creating this good creation, beginning with choosing Noah and then leading down through Noah's descendants to Abraham and Sarah to become a blessing to future generations. And then we know that through all of this, God's people are learning to live in a hostile world. There is a covenant, a formal covenant, which is a solemn agreement in which partners commit to each other for the long haul. There are 4 parts to a covenant: a choice, the partners, a sign of some sort, and a promise. And remember that a covenant will always be initiated by God. And then there is a blessing. The blessing is a concept that implies granting some favorable gift or experience or capacities to God's creation. God grants that ability for creation to continue through what he first created, especially when he signifies this by saying, prosper and multiply and fill the earth. And commitment is the third part. In the Old Testament, the setting begins with the story of creation. Problems come to rise when humans separate themselves from God. The story of the forbidden fruit in the early chapters of Genesis is an allegory of separation from God. Adam and Eve represent humankind as a whole in that story. And then Noah and his family represent a method for restoration to God. The flood is a way of cleansing and renewal. God's grace restores and restores goodness and gives another chance to humankind. So we'll be looking at Genesis chapters 6 through 9, and we'll be looking at some specific verses in those 3 chapters. In verse 5, the Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry that he had ever made them, and he put them on the earth, and it broke his heart. And the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, and I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds of the sky. I am sorry I ever made them. But Noah found favor with the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, the only blameless person living on earth at the time, and he walked in close fellowship with God. Noah was the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Then moving on to chapter 7. When everything was ready, the Lord said to Noah, go into the boat with all your family, for among all the people of the earth, I can see that you alone are righteous. Take with you 7 pairs, male and female, of each animal I have approved for eating and for sacrifice, and take 1 pair of each of the others. Also, take 7 pairs of every kind of bird. There must be a male and a female in each pair to ensure that all life will survive on the earth after the flood. 7 days from now, I will make the rains pour down on the earth, and it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights until I have wiped from the earth all the living things I have created. So Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him. And so there we have the background scripturally for the story of the flood. So let's take a look at one of my favorite things, a map. This is a map that shows the rivers in Mesopotamia, especially the Tigris and the Euphrates, and some of their subsidiaries you can see coming out of the mountains from the area that is today Turkey. So the rivers clearly show where a floodplain would be located. And you can see this by the different highlighting of the soil. You can see the mountainous areas along here, all the way up around the edges of Mesopotamia. And then in Mesopotamia, where the lowlands next to the rivers are, you can see with this abundance of water coming out of the mountains that it would easily be considered a floodplain. And then recall, this is the view that people have of the earth at the ancient time we're talking about. Kind of the snow globe effect where we're closed into a specific area. We are living on a flat earth, so they're flat earthers, so to speak. And then around and above is the firmament with the stars and the sun and the moon. Above that is considered water. So it is the sky with the water, so an ocean in heaven, kind of like our atmospheric rivers that we talk about nowadays, I guess. And then the pillars holding up the earth on either side. And below also we have the ocean. And so we're surrounded by water in the sky and below us, according to this ancient view of the world. And it's flat, so the water has really nowhere to go, according to this view. So continuing the story, we're going to be taking a look at a video that I hope will help us understand today the concepts of flooding in the ancient world. The world was what the people would know around them, the cultures and world of ancient Mesopotamia. And the flood story, or stories, because there were multiple stories, were told to explain why this great flood happened. In Sumeria, Assyria, and Babylon, they also have old flood stories that are even older than the one that Israel tells. So we know the ancient people's point of view was of a flat earth enclosed in a globe sphere above. So in the ancient world, the question was not a scientific question like we would think of now in our Western way of thinking. It was not a question of how something happened, because we could explain it scientifically, which they could not. So it was a question of why did this happen? And so an explanation was needed for a catastrophe. And in this case, as in most cases, there was always a story that involved a divine reason for the event that was catastrophic. Okay, let's take a look at the video.
So what about the Tower of Babel? Could the Mesopotamian ziggurat have been the setting, if not the...
Oops, let's get back to the right one. Lesson 1, verses, or not verses, minutes 17.
Always played a major role in the story of humankind. After the emergence of Homo sapiens, several glacial periods sharply reduced the Earth's temperature and lowered the levels of the oceans. This forced the early humans to use fire as a source of warmth and possibly as a means to cook their food. After the last glacial period, which ended some 12,000 years ago, the gradual warming of the Earth led to several animal species becoming extinct, not only because of the warmer temperature, but also because of changes in vegetation. In Mesopotamia, the greatest climate threat was flooding. Unlike the predictable Nile in Egypt, the Euphrates and the Tigris could rise at any moment to destroy farming fields and the carefully built network of irrigation that sustained them. Modern research has found traces of a catastrophic flood that must have occurred some 5,000 years ago, during the dawn of the great civilization of Sumer. Among others, we have a very ancient tablet known as the Sumerian King List, which is roughly dated around 2000 BC. It offers a list of all the kings of Sumer, and remarkably, it is organized into two groups: kings before and after the flood. Now, samples taken from river sediments near Shupurak, modern-day Tel Farah in Iraq, show that there was a severe disruption of the local settlement and pottery production around 2900 BC, more or less supporting what the Sumerian King List says. Now, fast forward some 5,000 years, and in the 1920s, the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, when digging near the ancient site of the city of Ur, today called Tel al-Muqayyar in today's Iraq, he was astonished to find a deep layer of perfectly clean clay, uniform throughout, the texture of which showed that it had been laid there by water. The layer of clay was no less than 8 feet deep. So this great flood may have been the inspiration for many local stories of the flood, including perhaps the story of Noah's Ark. As Genesis tells us, the earth's population then became corrupt, and the earth was filled with violence. God came to regret that he had placed human beings in charge of his creation. And so he decided to destroy them with a great flood. Only one man and his family would be saved, and his name was Noah. How were Noah and his family supposed to escape from this great cataclysm? By building a boat. Not just any boat, but a large ship, an ark of cypress wood. And it's interesting that God even gave Noah detailed specifications of how this ark should be built. Make the length of the ark 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above. Now, the Sumerian cubit was roughly a foot and a half. So this was going to be a very large boat. And then said God, of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind, male and female. Now, assuming that the story of the Great Flood first emerged in Sumer around 1600 before the Common Era, the question is, did the technology to build such a large boat exist? And surprisingly, the answer is yes. As early as 1895, archaeologists found a ceremonial bark near the pyramid of Sesostris III of the 12th dynasty, who lived in the 19th century BC. In many tombs of New Kingdom pharaohs, we even have detailed models of what such ships would look like. Granted, these ships are small, but what is remarkable is that they were built using mortise and tenon joints, which makes the vessel incredibly strong. Interestingly enough, the ark specifications in Genesis do not provide for a rudder or a sail, as in the case of these Egyptian boats. I think that may suggest that the ark was not meant to be navigated at all, but merely carried on the waters and guided by the protective hand of God. And so it came to pass. Once Noah, his family, and all the animals were safely stowed aboard, the windows of the heavens were opened, and it rained for 40 days and nights, killing every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. So, in effect, what we see here is the reversal of the creation narrative. Just as the waters brought forth the first forms of life, so too do the waters now extinguish that life across the planet. But eventually, the waters subsided, and the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now, many people think this refers to Mount Ararat, which is the name of a tall mountain today on the border of Turkey and Armenia. Some people believe that a large impression in the earth near Durupinar, Turkey, was left by the ark, but most geologists believe it's just a natural formation. The fact of the matter is that Genesis refers to Hare Ararat, the plural mountains of Ararat, and we believe that that must be located in Armenia. But what is so striking about the Noah story is that Genesis once again uses literary motifs that were well known in both the Sumerian and Babylonian civilizations. Let me give you an example. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods decide to destroy humankind with an immense inundation. But then the water god, Enki, takes pity on a man called Atrahasis and urges him to build a boat. This vessel, the god tells him, should be filled with all of his possessions, including animals and birds. An even greater parallel is found in the famous epic of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, the first great city of the Sumerian civilization. In this epic, it is an ancestor of King Gilgamesh, a man called Utnapishtim, who is the hero of the story. In those days, the epic says, The world teemed, the people multiplied, the world bellowed like a wild bull. The gods found this most annoying, so they decided to do away with these noisy humans. But one god, Ea, remembered his promise to protect Utnapishtim, and so he tells him to build a boat. Just as in Genesis, the god then provides detailed specifications. These are the measurements of the bark as you shall build her, he says. Let her beam be equal to her length. Let her deck be roofed like the vault that covers the abyss. Then take up in the boat the seed of all living creatures. And thus Utnapishtim is saved. These examples remind us that the stories of Genesis originated in a very particular place and time, and that Genesis uses the legends and images that people were familiar with to make its case for one God. As it happened, that place and time was the first great civilization on earth, the territory of Sumer, today's Iraq. It's here in the land of Mesopotamia, literally the land of two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, that we see the rise of the first major cities. One of the most powerful and earliest of these city-states was Uruk, which the Bible calls Erech. It may also be the root of the word Iraq. Because of the development of irrigation canals, these cities began to produce a large agricultural surplus that could be traded for other things from the surrounding territories. As a result, Sumer became very wealthy, and in the process was able to support the rise of artisans who could produce clothing, create tools, build monuments, or carve sculptures of the local gods. In sum, the rise of a culture. As for most other ancient civilizations, that was the principal economic activity. So it's not surprising that the earliest gods were closely intertwined with agricultural needs. For example, as we've seen, Enki was the god of water. Utu was the god of the sun.
All right, so that gives us a pretty good explanation of the plausibility of a great flood. Plus, it also tells us that these stories are methods of communication to the people of why something happened, not how it happened. And also, it shows that there's one God who is in control according to ancient cultures. So some more thoughts on the flood. These are solely my thoughts that came to mind as I was putting this lesson together. You may, of course, have additional things, or you may not agree with me, but at least it's something to think about. So water is life-giving. We need to have water. We cannot survive, not plants, nor animals, nor people. And out of the chaos and water, the Creator made heaven and earth in Genesis. Water is a representation also of cleansing. The flood story can be seen as a rejuvenation and then a restoration or a new beginning or a second chance for humankind. John baptized Jesus, symbolizing a new relationship with Abba in the New Testament. And in modern times, we still baptize people into a new life with Jesus. These are things that signify the restoration and renewal of a life. Then we can look at Noah and his descendants. They are told to multiply and fill the earth in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 9. Then further on in chapter 9, God's sign of a covenant is made with Noah and his descendants, and as well as all creation. We enjoy seeing the sign of the covenant that is represented here in this story, which is our rainbow after a nice shower of rain, which we appreciate so much in Northern California. This is the first of two covenants that God will make in Genesis. And then recall that a covenant is always initiated by God. So in a way, the flood story is a version of creation all over again. One man named Noah was the beginning of a second chance, and there are commands for him and his family to be fruitful and multiply. Thinking back to Adam and Eve, there is one son, Ham, who does not follow Yahweh's laws. As in Adam and Eve, Cain did not follow the laws of God in his bringing of an offering and probably in other areas of his life. There is also a new creation of plants and animals. And think about it, do you see any other connections that go all the way back to the beginning of Genesis and the original creation stories? A little fun. You know, we love to talk about unicorns. Here's a little joke for you. Genesis chapters 10 and 11. They are really transitional chapters. Genealogy is used to show the passage of time, and it's also showing the lineage from Adam to his son Seth, then from Seth down to Noah, then from Noah's son Shem, eventually through to Terah and the birth of Abram. Abram will become the progenitor of the Hebrews. Genealogies, which often in the Old Testament are called the begats, and they have a function. They're there for a reason. They show God's at work through history. They point out how things are connected, and they are a source of identity for ancient Israel. This is important to the ancient Israelites because once they are scattered abroad by wars and they lose connections with each other. But one way you can reconnect is through your stories of your history, like the stories of creation and the stories of Noah, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs that we'll be studying in a few lessons. And they will point out how all of these things are connected. So the people or the begats are a source of identity for ancient Israel to draw them back together as a united community in the future. This is a repeat. I'm not quite sure why I put this in here, but here it is again, just a little reminder that there are three themes that we keep looking for in the Pentateuch, that they are commitment to the creation, God's commitment to creation, that God chose people to be blessings to future generations, beginning with Abraham and Sarah, and that Israel and we, even today, are having to learn to live in a hostile world. And now the story of Babel, which is just like a complete change of things here at the end of this section. It's like all of a sudden, here is the story of Babel and why the Tower of Babel and why is it here. For me, when I was reading through this and when I was watching the video, it came to mind like this was like an early Pentecost almost experience, because here we have this people who are talking in one language here by the Tower of Babel, trying to find God, but maybe it is rising up to find God, but maybe not the right God, possibly, not the one God. Whereas at Pentecost, after the ascension of Jesus, we have the disciples going out. They're now apostles of the word of God, and they are speaking in languages that all the people can understand. So it's almost like this story tells us how languages are dispersed amongst the different tribes of people in the world, where then when we get to Pentecost, here comes a time when the apostles bring all of this news about one God and about Jesus in the languages of all the people who are there gathered in this city. Anyway, that was just my connection that I made. So we'll take a look at what our historian has to say about it. It has been suggested that this whole story of the Tower of Babel is just a slam against the Babylonians, as of course the word Babel and Babylonian are connected. And so it might be just a slam against them and their multiple gods, whereas the Hebrews' God came down to people and was relational with his creation. The Babylonians would have to reach up to the heavens for their gods. So also might go back to where I said earlier in the lesson that the Hebrews or Israelites might say, my God is better than your God. Okay, let's have a look at this and see if I can get it on the correct lesson.
Over time, this cadre grew into a powerful constituency. Records from the third dynasty of Ur, for example, refer to a community of belief, members of the clergy, or worshippers. Most of these figures depict either a male or a clay or So what about the Tower of Babel? Could the Mesopotamian ziggurat have been the setting, if not the inspiration for the story? Well, let's take a closer look. According to Genesis, the story is set in a time when the whole earth had one language and the same words. So clearly this must refer to some primordial time when the people of the earth had yet to develop diverse cultures and languages. Genesis claims that the people of the city of Babel had invented a new technology, the creation of bricks from baked clay. Now, that's a very interesting point, because unlike in Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia were usually built from mud brick. Come, said the people of Babel, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top may reach into the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. The description in Genesis echoes the building methods of Mesopotamia. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. So the suggestion that there may be a correlation between the ziggurat and the story of the Tower of Babel is definitely plausible. Of course, in Genesis, the Babel project did not remain hidden from God for long. The Lord came down to see the city, says the Bible, and the tower which the children of men had built. Rather than destroying this monumental project, God decided to confuse their language there so that they will not understand each other's speech. Unable to communicate with one another, the builders left the city and were scattered abroad. Now there's an interesting coda to the story, because the name Babel is a typical example of the fondness in Genesis for double meanings. On the one hand, the Akkadian word Bab-ili means the gate of the gods, and that is very likely the root of the word Babylon. But Balal in Hebrew also means something like sowing confusion, and it may actually be related to the English verb to babble. So Genesis places the story in the land of Shinar, a term that is used elsewhere for Babylon. Babylon, as we know, was founded in the 1860s BC by the Amorites, a group of people who originally hailed from Syria, Canaan. But the message from Genesis that the idea of building a tower would lead to ruin did come to pass. Not in Sumer, but in Egypt. You see, the task of building a huge pyramid complex consumed a pharaoh's attention from the moment he took office, and it also drained his treasury. By the end of the Old Kingdom, around 2184 BC, Egypt lay exhausted from the burden of building pyramids. Its troubles were compounded by a downturn in the international trade and the failure of harvests.
Okay, so we have a little different view of what the Tower of Babel may have been all about. It is a mystery. I'm not sure how much significance we should attach to this story, but it is there and can, I'm sure, be used to some benefit for the Testament study. So moving on a little bit here, we have the word Semitic that comes from the name Shem. And Semitic is a term that is used for the nomadic people that moved throughout Canaan. The story of the Tower of Babel is not told in any of the other cultures, like we have learned that the creation story or the flood story are told in some of the other nearby cultures and surrounding cultures. So we're not sure why it was included into the book of Genesis. And here we are at the end of a lesson. And again, time to take a look back and think, what themes did we notice throughout this lesson? How was God relating to people, and how were people relating back to God in the stories that we read? Were there any particular patterns that you noticed? And what thoughts, comments, or questions do you have about this portion of the scripture? And we were on Genesis chapter 6 through 9 is what we were reading about. And then 10 through 11 were the stories of the begats, the generations of people between Noah and going on into the next section where we began looking at the patriarchs. So this week is the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. We know that Jesus celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles. In the book of John, it talks about Jesus going to Jerusalem for this celebration. So in modern day, here is our local synagogue here in Napa, and it is going to be celebrating Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, on Friday, September 29th. And they make it into a fun and family affair, which I think is pretty cool. So they build and decorate some type of a temporary structure, kind of like a tent. And then they gather together and they celebrate Sabbath, or Sabbath, and they have a potluck. And so they socialize, and then they have a study of the Torah on Saturday. So it's a 2-day event. Here's a picture of a modern day tent or tabernacle, a temporary structure. And it has different things decorating the inside and so on. And children are very involved in these activities. So here is another type of temporary structure. It's kind of neat. It has some roofing, temporary roofing that looks like they're using some plant material of some sort, and kind of a canvas or cotton exterior. And some comfortable lounge chairs to sit outside and visit with your friends. As we look through and learn a little bit about the Feast of Tabernacles, we can look back into Leviticus. Leviticus, remember, is the book that gives the laws of the priests to follow. So in Leviticus 23, verse 39, it says, it adds an 8th day of rest to the feast that follows the celebrations of the Feast of Tabernacles. The setting for chapters John chapters 7 and 8 at the Tabernacles also continues to have an Exodus backdrop, meaning they're temporary structures because they were on the move out of Egypt. The Mishnah records that the liturgical rites of tabernacles include some kind of water libation, not washing of hands or washing of feet, and also a torchlit procession. This image of the water and the light will figure into Jesus's teaching during the Feast of Tabernacles, and you can read that in John chapter 7, verses 37 and 38, and in chapter 8, verses 12. You can see where Jesus uses water and light, and it is during the time of the Feast of Tabernacles that he is doing a teaching in the synagogue. So if you just feel like delving into the New Testament for a minute, that might be something you would like to read. So let's have a little summary here of Genesis chapters 4 through 11. The first chapters of Genesis were preparing for the beginning of the story of Israel. So now we will move into the story of building an identity for the Hebrew people as a tribal society. And we will do that through the promise of descendants and land and the struggle to maintain unity as a people. Suggested reading. These are always much better. If you have done the background reading, you have a better understanding of these slides as we go through them. So I recommend that you start with Genesis 11, where we left off, and read through 25. That's quite a lot, but take a couple of weeks. We'll cover that in 2 to 3 weeks. So if you are working on this background reading, that is a good thing to prep you for the future. And I wish you a good week, and I will see you next week for lesson 4, and we'll start on the patriarchs.